ready to move on to LCB restructuring at this point, which is on me. Okay, thanks, John. Okay, so LCB restructuring. We do not have a bill number and we do not have a sponsor. I'd like to talk a little bit, though, about how this idea came to be. And then I do have a slideshow to sort of go through some of the different elements. I'm getting lots and lots of questions about it because there have been lots of attempts to sort of talk about how we might envision the Liquor and Cannabis Board a little bit differently. So I want to hop into the Wayback Machine. When I-502 came to be, the decision was that at the time, the Liquor and Control Board was going to be the regulating body for cannabis. The primary purpose of that is that, along with the Department of Revenue, the Liquor Control Board was sort of the tax collecting body for liquor. So, along with the sort of enforcement side of things, which LCB is a part of, certainly for alcohol and tobacco and vapor, that because of our 37% excise tax, that seemed like a really logical place to put cannabis, given that that was the primary consideration of the state. Then, as the laws sort of went into effect, as I-502 was written, I think the ideal outcome here was that I-502 would sort of be written. I don't think anybody expected it to be perfect, but that it would be pretty stable early on so that then the enforcement side of it could just be adopted from LCB. I think it's been a really long time, probably, not probably. We know it's been, I can't even think of the last time an entirely new industry was voted into existence along with all of those regulations along with it. Denver or Colorado and us went at the same time. Colorado got theirs out a little bit faster. So they, I think, had cannabis going to market before Washington State did. But essentially what happened as a result of that was once I-502 was on the books, LCB was differently from the responsibilities that they had in the past, also responsible for then working through all of the ways a brand new law, a system of laws, would need to be reformed over time once we actually got into practice. I think this is a huge learning opportunity for the state. And unfortunately, what has sort of happened with the Liquor and Cannabis Board, the way I sort of describe it, is it's turned into, a little bungalow that's had addition upon addition. Now we've got a couple of extra bedrooms, and now we have a garage and a kitchen, and all these extra parts have been put on with cannabis. So along with cannabis has come a lot of agricultural regulation, laboratory regulation, things that do not exist for tobacco, vapor, and alcohol, as well as a public health and prevention component, of which there has always been a liaison there, but now there is actually an entire sort of education and research department dedicated at the Liquor and Cannabis Board, that is fairly new. It sort of morphed into that. That was not necessarily the original intent of that research program. And is not necessarily the explicit directive of that program, but so far a lot of that work has sort of been focused in that area. And so, as we know, with a house that has lots of additions, sometimes the mechanisms didn't keep up with the growth. So sometimes, if you've ever looked at one of those houses, the electrical's a little goofy, the plumbing's kind of wonky, and maybe you have to stand on one foot and hop up and down to get the garbage disposal to work, right? So, we see that in effect in the structure of it itself. So in the last 10 years, there have been multiple proposals to sort of address these issues. Those proposals, I think a lot of times have been born out of just some really deep frustration. And oftentimes, I think the proposals have been bigger than what the legislature is capable of making decisions about, or just sort of seems too heavy of a lift for that reform to come, and or sometimes when born out of a specific frustration is not comprehensive enough and more of sort of a shot across the bow at the Liquor and Cannabis Board rather than a serious attempt at actually making meaningful reform that will genuinely address the problem. And I want to say this because wow, there are certainly circumstances and incidences where I have some pretty passionate views that might be directed at an individual within the Liquor and Cannabis Board. That is not the posture that we are intending to take with this, because what we see is that we have had opportunities to engage on particular items or with the way somebody has sort of conducted their responsibilities at the Liquor and Cannabis Board. However, addressing those issues is not fixing the systemic problem. And what we are talking about is a real systemic problem that is not specific to any one particular issue, item, or individual. So this is not at all an attempt to go after an individual. There's also been, lots of public testimony at the Liquor and Cannabis Board, as well as in front of the legislature and even some other places, sort of testifying to what I believe is well-deserved anger and frustration at how really important processes have been carried out. This is, again, very, very intentionally an attempt to look at the structural change, regardless of the individuals in there, so that we can, again, make something meaningful and ongoing. Some of those earlier proposals included things like expanding the number of members on the board from 3 to 5, with sort of different versions of appointment. The idea being, I think, that just maybe more people would create greater transparency. At the time, the Cannabis Alliance was sort of against that proposal. It had more to do with how those additional spots were going to be put in, and had more to do with, again, the mechanisms that made it sort of seem like it might instead be easier to weight the board down from special interests rather than create greater transparency. However, I have now been working on this for a couple of years, and in speaking with board members, both past and present, that is a deep frustration of theirs that they can't meet. They can't talk to each other except for in a public meeting. I will say, though, especially with recent efforts to sort of close down public comment and stakeholder interaction, that I deeply appreciate the fact that there is more view and insight into the conversations that board members have with one another, in regards to how decisions are made. Also, one that has been around in a variety of different iterations is moving all cannabis regulation slash at least manufacturing and production over to the Department of Agriculture. I think that there's a lot of folks that are behind this, and I myself had a lot of support for it to begin with. But the further I dug into a really comprehensive solution, the more I could sort of see where a wholesale moving would be really challenging for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is, in particular, some of the legal enforcement, which WSDA doesn't really have any mechanism for doing, and then also the tax collection portion as well. Anything having to do on the retail side of things, WSDA doesn't have any mechanism for that. That proposal made it some distance last year, enough so that there was a fiscal note attached to it, and the fiscal note that WSDA attached to it was in the 300,000, I think maybe even more than that, dollar amount in order to make that move over there, which of course, while we are digging for change in the couch cushions in order to make our budget go, was again a dead on arrival. So you'll recall from earlier this morning when we were talking about fiscal notes, that's always a really easy, fast way to kill a bill. And in this case, it did that. There is another proposal that is already also on the table, and that would be creating a Office of Cannabis Management within the Liquor and Cannabis Board. So rather than creating a whole new agency or sending things over to the Department of Agriculture, this would create a singular, under that umbrella, just addressing cannabis, which I think is getting much closer to sort of what we're proposing, which I'll get into here in just a minute. One thing I do want to flag here is that, like I said, everybody is always interested in looking at what other states are doing to see if it's no state wants to be the first to do a thing, and so everybody wants to look at other states. So the most common configuration across the country as it relates to hemp and cannabis is a separate office, not dissimilar to Oregon, the OLCC, that regulates hemp and cannabis activity discreetly on its own. That's something that I think is worthwhile for Washington State to explore. However, given our current budgetary considerations, I don't know that that's a realistic step. We could probably spend the next 10 years shouting that at the legislature, with the legislature saying, oh, yeah, good idea, but that's very expensive. And I think we're mostly kind of doing okay, which we all know we are not doing okay. What we are proposing is a simple restructuring of the Liquor and Cannabis Board. Again, I'll get into that in just a minute, but a little bit of a line of the deficiencies that we see right now, and why I believe that those are systemic. Overall, one of the primary concerns that we have with activity happening at LCB, and it's one that's been going on for a long time, and that's the relationship between the lawmaking, the rulemaking, which we've talked today quite a lot about, what those mechanisms look like. And I want to actually, I'm going to pause there for a minute. And enforcement. So there was a bill passed, I believe, in 2017 that sort of redefined how enforcement was done at the Liquor and Cannabis Board. Some of it had to do with who was allowed to carry firearms out in the field when they were doing enforcement. And then it also created education officers. So prior to that bill being passed, it was only enforcement officers when they did on-site visits, they saw something, a compliance issue that needed attention. Their calling was to write an AVN for that and issue that, and then that put somebody into an enforcement process right away. And meanwhile, again, just a quick reminder, everybody is brand new at this, enforcement officers and licensees to begin with. Most other regulatory agencies, compliance is the first most important thing that they want. And so there's a lot of time, effort, and energy put into making sure that there are education efforts to bring somebody into compliance, engaging in enforcement activity only when it is clear that the businesses operating are aware of the compliance, are capable of meeting it, and then choosing not to. And then that's how enforcement gets engaged. Unfortunately, I say this a lot of times on the enforcement side of things, and even in licensing as well. The general posture of the Liquor and Cannabis Board, stigma still runs deep as sort of the industry are criminals engaging in criminal activity, and it is this agency's job to catch us doing that and to, from a very punitive perspective, do everything they can to ensure that folks can no longer be in business. Now, I'm not describing everybody in Liquor and Cannabis Board. I'm talking about a general systemic approach to how this regulating body works with our businesses and patients and consumers, in fact. Um, so, with that, what we're seeing a lot of happening is enforcement moving ahead of the law. We have several examples. We've got a couple of lawsuits in place, in particular around testing right now, is sort of the most stark version of that. We have a situation where enforcement officers are misinterpreting or extra interpreting the law as it's written. They're moving forward with enforcement. Businesses are receiving AVNs and notices to correct, and sort of getting deadlines to meet those. Meanwhile, those businesses are sort of going through the appeals process and saying, this is not what the law says. We are at a point where we do have rulemaking that is open and agreed upon to make clarification where there isn't any. We have agreement from other agencies that work with laboratories, like the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health. We've also gotten legislators involved. We're working on getting the the AG's office involved in this as well, to say, hey, we can't do enforcement on laws that don't exist yet. Like I said, we have the Washington Administrative Code that sets requirements for how laws are made, and individuals out in the field as enforcement officers are not allowed to write laws. Yet somehow that's sort of what continues to happen. And then what we have found as we've been giving pushback on this is that we're sort of bereft of a line of accountability within the agency for when things like this happen. And that comes from just from the way the Liquor and Cannabis Board is structured. So, as it stands right now, the Liquor and Cannabis Board is made up of three board members. That board is sort of the chair of the board is appointed to the governor's office. So the chair of the board and the other two members are appointed by the governor's office. They are there for a term, and once they have been appointed, they have to actually go through impeachment process to be removed, or they themselves can resign. So once a board member is there, they're sort of there. If the governor changes, the new governor would have to, if they didn't agree with what was happening, go through a very lengthy impeachment process in order to remove one of those board members. Those board members are responsible for approving new regulations that come through, and then they're also the adjudicating body for when somebody receives action on their license or they're going through an appeals process. The board is the group of folks that makes decisions about whether that licensee can continue to operate or not, or what sort of disciplinary action is going to be taken should that case be outside of just the normal course of correction that would happen according to the law. Then the board hires the director of the Liquor and Cannabis Board, and the director is sort of in charge of the departments, the administrative responsibilities of making sure the Liquor and Cannabis Board runs. And so what that has created, and the director serves sort of at the pleasure of the board. So what that has created is sort of and then, sorry, I'm going to pause one more time. And then underneath these two sort of side by side, nearly, leadership components are the departments within Liquor and Cannabis Board. There's education and enforcement, licensing. I haven't seen a recent flow chart, but public policy and rulemaking is in there. And so then under that, there are specialists that attend to liquor, tobacco and vapor, and cannabis. But that again is under the activity that's being performed. And so oftentimes between the directors, the heads of those departments, the actual director, Director Lucella, and then the board itself, there's a little bit of a leadership vacuum, right? So oftentimes decisions are intended to be made in tandem. If you sat on the executive management teams, there's lots of conversation that happens there that looks like there's sort of shared responsibility for leadership. But what we have found is when things break down, there's a lot of ability to say, well, we need to talk to the director, or this is a board decision, or this is Will Lukella's job, or and so there's sort of like just this empty space where it is very reasonable to suggest that there are decisions that can be made where nobody actually is fully responsible for those decisions being made. And so in particular, when we are requesting accountability, that Spider-Man meme where all the Spider-Mans are pointing at each other, that's frequently what can happen. So I'm gonna go to my share screen here. We are working on a Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board efficiency and reform bill. We are, like I said, we do not yet have a sponsor. We have lots of interested parties, but this is such a heavy lift, and it really gets to the fundamental format of government. So we were on a wonderful path with Governor Inslee's office, as well at the time, even members of the LCB, including David Postman, who was the chair at the time. And there was a lot of sort of belief that perhaps this might be of interest to everybody there. Last year, however, with the election cycle, we had sort of really massive turnover in government, which is a good thing. That I think is a healthy thing for government. But that means an all new governor's office, all new staff members. There was a shakeup with the Liquor and Cannabis Board as well. Big changes there. And so we kind of had to go back to square one with that coalition building, not entirely square one, but back to the beginning there a little bit. We have been calling it restructuring, but we are doing, again, getting more specific with our language and calling it board efficiency and reform. This structural change aims to streamline the decision-making process, increase operational efficiency, and centralize regulatory oversight under a clear authority, so that when there does need to be accountability and remedy of challenges within the process, there is a clear line of oversight and accountability directly from the governor's office, which is true of almost all other regulatory agencies in the state. This represents modernization with an effort aimed at reducing costs, enhancing regulatory efficiency, and improving public health coordination. I want to pause there. I've given so much information. Any questions? Okay, and so I'll start with the big headline, and I think this part is the most controversial part. I am aware. I have had this conversation with all of the board members at LCB. They are aware that this is a part of this component. I will also say this is our proposal, and we are certainly open to deeper conversation and maybe even a slower approach to this. However, the proposal that we are making does sort of eliminate the board from that structure. Now, when I say eliminate, that board might stay as an adjudicating body within the Department of Health, for example. There are multiple adjudicating bodies. There's the Medical Quality Assurance Commission, the Pharmacy Quality Assurance Commission. There's a commission for nursing. Like I said, I think there's like 32 different adjudicating bodies within the Department of Health that goes through and does, which is the main job of the current Liquor and Cannabis Board. They just would no longer sort of be the top decision-making body about rules, laws, and regulations as well. Um, and so you'll see with an eye towards cost, I don't know if you were aware of this, but changing the name of an agency is really expensive. You have to change all of the things. And so we wanted to make sure that we were trying to take the budget into consideration. So we're going to keep LCB. You'll notice that when cannabis was added, we moved from the Liquor and Control Board to the Liquor and Cannabis Board. So it remained LCB. And that was a budgetary consideration. So changing it instead from the Liquor and Cannabis Board to the Liquor and Cannabis Bureau. What this does then is it makes the director the cabinet appointed position from the governor. And so that there is then, instead of sort of at the very top, a swirling sort of lack of direct accountability, there would be a very clear line of accountability. There would be a clear decision maker at the top that is accountable to the governor's office. And everything that is happening then under that umbrella. And then under that would be this adjudicating body should that decide to stay. Or within the Washington Administrative Code, there is an appeals process that does not necessarily require a board. With this also is sort of a reimagining of that public health and public education and prevention. That's not to say that research couldn't stay with LCB. I think there's lots of benefits to it being there. However, the emphasis on public health and prevention would remain in the Department of Health. We do believe that that's where the experts are. That's where a lot of the funding is at. And so we believe that there's, a much more appropriate and comprehensive approach that can be done within the Department of Health that seems to be a little misplaced within the Liquor and Cannabis Board. I think all of us, I'll speak for myself. I'm a firm believer in agencies and entities should do what they do best. And I think that the Liquor and Cannabis Board is sort of dipping into the lane of the Department of Health a little bit as it's expanded its sort of line of interest into public health and prevention. I think LCB can be a good partner, but perhaps best done in the department that is designated for that. Agency designated for that. So as I said, changing board to bureau. I think I accidentally already covered all of this on the previous slide. The only downside to that is that, of course, There is always the chance that we may end up with a governor that is really unfriendly to cannabis. I find that unlikely, but I just want to acknowledge that there is a little bit of a gamble here, that there is always the chance that we could end up with a governor who is unfriendly to cannabis or unfriendly to cannabis, alcohol, and tobacco, could put a director in there in a way that does make everybody's life a little bit more challenging. However, I would say that with that clear line of accountability comes a dramatic improvement of transparency so that voters have better insight on what's happening. And what we do know is that cannabis has wildly broad support amongst the electorate here in Washington state. And so with that transparency, I think comes an ability to right the ship a little bit more easily than we currently have. One of the other things that we're proposing is a change in regulatory divisions so that it would start with the director, and then immediately under the director are separate divisions of liquor, cannabis, vapor, and tobacco, so that the activity being done, whether that's licensing, enforcement, rulemaking, is categorized by the thing that it is regulating. The idea here is, again, better efficiency, greater experts, a greater line of transparency in there, but then also particularly on the rulemaking side of things and the relationship between rulemaking and enforcement, which is often broken down at LCB, that those would be within the same department to some degree, so that there is a more appropriate expression of rulemaking than into enforcement. And then also, it has set up structurally an opportunity to break cannabis off into its own department with hemp potentially later on down the road when maybe there is a better budget circumstance, or there's a critical mass of decision making that needs to be done, so much so that there is more political will to create a separate office. So with that, then the director responsibilities would be licensing and regulatory compliance, enforcement, oversight of industry operations and standards, and financial management and auditory accountability. So just what you would imagine any director of any agency, which is that executive sort of position for the agency, just like the head of a company or anything else, would sort of have that immediate oversight in a way that reports to the governor's office. We've already talked a little bit about this. That public health and outreach shift would transition primarily back over to the Department of Health. All of those functions would remain there, where we do believe that there's a stronger, greater, more informed impact on ensuring that people have quality information. I think a really great example, there's a new campaign, and I'll see if I can grab it really quickly to put in the chat, that the Department of Health put out about safe cannabis use for new users that I think has been really effective. They did a lot of stakeholder feedback. They engaged the industry. I know that there's a couple of key components in there that came directly from that, and I think it's going to really reach an audience so that folks are consuming the right amount of cannabis, they're storing it safely, and they know what to do when they think that they might have gotten into trouble. And then again, allows LCB to focus on that regulatory and compliance side of things. We see lots of operational and fiscal improvements, streamlined decision making, fewer bureaucratic delays. At one point, I think they're moving a little bit through the backlog, but as we've already talked about, 5403 rulemaking, that law is going to affect January 1st. And I don't know that we're going to get rules before the summertime. It's certainly not, the rules are certainly not going to be done by January 1st. And in some cases, in particular, that cannabinoid bill, I think it's been 2 years after the law was passed for the rules to actually come out, which is a really deep and wildly problematic timeline. With that just comes all of the enhanced regulatory efficiency and again, clarity and transparency, and that clear chain of accountability. As anytime there is any restructuring, there is going to be a little bit of a budgetary consideration. Like I said, we've done our very best to take all of that in and minimize them to its maximal account. However, we do genuinely believe and very sure this is long term, but should be realized within year two or three. That there is, of course, the elimination of the compensation for those three board members, which is fairly minimal comparatively, but it also does reduce administrative and meeting related costs. We have done a little bit of an analysis of the administrative costs, and LCB spends quite a lot of money for the size of agency it is just on having people attend meetings, which is necessary, right? When you have a lot of lateral movement in decision making and activity instead of, again, sort of a clear line of accountability and well-defined locuses of influence and responsibility. Which again consolidates regulatory functions to reduce redundancy. And again, like I said, doing our best to minimize the costs of transition. And then, like I said, sort of again, moving that public health component over to DOH, we're sort of arguing actually strengthens that public health message on the side of things. It's more focused. LCB can be more focused on licensing and compliance operations to ensure that businesses are operating above, at the law or better. And celebrating things like 2 to 6% compliance on age gating above alcohol is a really big deal. And, finding ways to look at that and then expand that out further because that will be the main focus of the Liquor and Cannabis Board. And then, of course, Department of Health gets to do what it does really well, which is ensuring that there's quality education and outreach for improved public health outcomes. And then just in general, as these departments are a little bit more focused on the content, that we have more coherent regulatory structures across alcohol, cannabis, vapor, and tobacco. Jason, you weren't kidding. That does feel like a long time talking. Like I said, with this, we are continuing to really build a strong argument. We're building small coalitions, particularly of licensees at this time that have been through some fairly egregious interactions with the Liquor and Cannabis Board. We've seen a lot of that happen around social equity in particular, but then also some really high quality rule following licensees have received a lot of negative attention around unclear rules. Meanwhile, we are all aware of licensees who are fairly, blatantly violating the law. The Cannabis Alliance is not at all interested in turning individuals in, but what we are interested is making comprehensive, enforceable, meaningful laws that make this business operate as fairly as it possibly can. Again, a vital, ethical, equitable, and sustainable cannabis industry. And I think 10 years in, what is clear to us is that we can pass as many laws, any of the things that we've talked about here today, but as long as that rulemaking process has to go through the Liquor and Cannabis Board, we will never be as effective at the ongoing reform I-502 requires until the agency that is tasked with regulating it is running as smoothly as it needs to in order for, again, $1 billion of biennium industry to operate. I could talk probably longer. I'm going to pause there. Thoughts, questions, comments, concerns?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Uh, what pushback? Who's pushing back? And who's on your side? Your side.
Yeah. I think so far I've had a lot of positive feedback. Some less excited folks, of course, our board members are a little concerned. I'm coming after their job in a lot of ways. And that doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good to me either. I'll just be really frank. Like that's not my desired place to be at all. And that's why I think we've put some caveats in there. Like there's ways to keep their jobs just in a different format. in a different place like that. I'm not coming for individuals here. But and that's why I have felt comfortable speaking pretty frankly and transparently about this. Because again, this is not about individuals, it's about the overall structure. There's reticence there. From other folks within LCB, change is hard. And so just some, I've had a couple of comments. I remember David Postman saying to me, the grass is always greener. Like you're not going to get a perfect agency by doing this. My answer to him was, well, I'd like to try getting closer to a more amenable agency because what we do know is this version isn't working. We know that it isn't working by the number of lawsuits and the amount of money and manpower that LCB has had to pay out, particularly on cannabis cases over the last 10 years. But we've also seen some really serious incidences in alcohol on the alcohol enforcement side of things as well. And I will say, I'm talking from the cannabis side. We are working on building coalitions with key players from the alcohol side of things. There's lots of stories over there. Some of them have been very public, like the raids on gay bars that happened 2 years ago that were just wildly out of line, as well as things like bringing speakers to come talk about regulatory enforcement that were involved in racially motivated violence out in the street. Thankfully, that woman was not allowed to come speak. However, for a while, LCB was ready to double down on thinking that that was a good idea before public outcry sort of stopped them. And the idea that those kinds of things can happen again, without the folks at the top having any awareness about it, supposedly, until the public gets involved. I mean, and there it's frequent. It's frequent. It's time to look at a structural change. Other opposition is just the heaviness of the left, right? We're proposing a wholesale structural change in an agency that's been around for quite some time. That's a really big deal. It's not small. Government does not like doing big things, and they certainly don't like doing big things quickly. So, just convincing folks that this is an endeavor worthwhile is a big project. Like I said, we've already been working on it for a couple of years. We have some really key folks who are on board, and I think the best way. And Al, we're talking about LCB restructuring right now, and sort of wrapping that conversation up. And maybe you can jump in here too. But I think the best way I can describe the conversations that we have right now is a lot of interest. And oh yeah, actually, this sounds like a really good idea. I like this approach. Who else is on board? So we're in the process essentially of getting our first early adopter, and I feel really confident that once we sort of get that, we're on the track. Some of the strategy. So you'll notice we're talking about this very publicly without actually having a bill number yet, which is not usually how we go about things. Usually we find the sponsor and then go out to the public. However, because of that early adopterness, and because we know it's a good idea, we've done really good we've done thorough vetting of this so far, is that we need to build this, we need to do some rabble rousing. We need to show that there's momentum within the industry, within alcohol industry as well, so that the lawmakers, in particular our legislators, understand that constituents want this, the businesses, the people that they represent want this, that also then helping to tell the story of the impact that the lack of appropriate structure has had on businesses, so that the governor's office understands, especially right now, liquor and cannabis are in a free fall. We both contribute quite a lot to the budget, and all of our businesses are failing at rates we've never seen before, including on the hospitality side of things. There are more restaurant and bar closures in 2025 than there were in the first 12 months of COVID. It's bad. When we're looking at a landscape like that, I think that that makes it also a really ripe opportunity to make some meaningful change that's positive and impactful. I don't know. Do you want to add to that, Al?
Well, there's several components to it, but the one that I find most interesting is we've got members of the legislature, both on committees that we would report to or not, that are going, wow, I never thought about it before. This is interesting. And this is where it really helps with individuals contacting their as a constituent, their legislator directly and saying, hey, this is an issue, this is a problem, I am concerned, my business is affected, or whatever it is, which makes it easier from when we go in, Caitlin or myself, to say, hey, we need some help. Oh, yeah, I've gotten several letters on this, or I've gotten some calls. I prefer letters over emails and emails over calls, but you can do any or all of that. And it just really helps in trying to develop or formulate something. It's also going to be interesting that we have a new governor who is not really vocal, or I haven't heard uh, any talk about the Liquor and Cannabis Board, or anything related to cannabis. Period. And we do know that the former governor, Inslee, it was not a favorite subject of his. And so now's the time to try to make some waves. And not that anything can or will happen this session, it's possible, but it leads right into the elections and then the next session. So that when candidates are coming to us saying, hey, we would really like support for my campaign, you can say, would love to do it, but we need to talk about this issue first. So it's just how it goes, just how the process works.
Yeah. Yeah, and because it is a big lift, it is a big coalition to build, and that takes time. And so we've done the behind the scenes work so far, and we're now onto the public side of things. We're starting to work, like I said, with licensees to start giving that qualitative data about the deep impact that some of these problems are having. Again, while also being actively in the midst of trying to share a lot of information to stop enforcement action that's moving ahead of the law. And so, in addition to, there's lots of conversation about traceability and how that ball has been dropped at Liquor and Cannabis Board, and again, sort of where that accountability is at. Like I said, there's a variety of different lanes. There is also the auditor's office is in the midst of a second very large investigation about impropriety from enforcement officers. Like, there's lots of stories to tell, and again, we're trying really hard to tell those stories without coming at it from an antagonistic individuals against individuals, regulated folks being angry at the regulating body, but rather just an acknowledgement that there's a lot of dysfunction, again, like that house that's been added on to too much. And we won't solve all the problems. And there will, I think, of course, always be some antagonism for those being regulated against those that are in charge of doing the regulating. However, I'm confident we can do a better job with a better structure.